June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m., 20,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled his SBD Dauntless dive bomber in wide, desperate arcs, scanning the empty ocean below for the Japanese carrier fleet that should have been exactly where intelligence said it would be. His fuel gauge was dropping into the red zone. Behind him, 32 other Dauntless bombers from USS Enterprise followed in similar circles, their pilots watching their own fuel needles sink toward empty. They had been searching for nearly 2 hours, flying on fumes and hope. McCluskey's radio crackled with increasingly urgent voices. Pilots reporting fuel states that meant some wouldn't make it back to the carrier, even if they turned around immediately. The Japanese carriers, 4 of them, the most powerful striking force in the Pacific, had vanished into the vast blue emptiness of the ocean. What McCluskey didn't know at that moment was that 10,000 feet below him, the entire course of World War II was about to pivot on a decision he hadn't yet made. Within 20 minutes, the SBD Dauntless, an aircraft that Navy brass had dismissed as obsolete, that Japanese pilots mocked as slow and vulnerable, would sink 3 Japanese aircraft carriers in 5 minutes of the most devastating dive-bombing attack in naval history. The Battle of Midway, and with it the Pacific War, would be decided not by battleships or advanced fighters, but by a stubby, underpowered dive bomber that nobody believed in. The Douglas SBD Dauntless had never been anyone's idea of a war-winning weapon. When it entered service in 1940, it was already obsolete by the standards that would define World War II aviation. Its top speed of 255 miles per hour made it slower than many fighters. Its bomb load of 1,000 pounds was modest. Its defensive armament consisted of 2 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns and a single .30 caliber gun in the rear cockpit, operated by a radio operator gunner who sat backward, watching for enemy fighters while the pilot dove toward the target. But Ed Heinemann's design team at Douglas Aircraft had understood something that would prove more important than speed or firepower. They had created an aircraft that could survive. The Dauntless featured redundant hydraulic systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection for the crew, and a robust airframe that could withstand the punishing 7G pullout from a near-vertical dive. Where other dive bombers fell apart when pushed to their limits, the Dauntless kept flying. The Navy had ordered 144 SBDs in April 1939, a modest procurement that suggested limited confidence in the aircraft's potential. By December 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, the Navy had 171 Dauntless bombers scattered across its carrier fleet and Marine Corps squadrons. They would need every single one. The path to Midway had been paved with American defeats and hard-learned lessons. At Pearl Harbor, on December 7th, 1941, SBD Dauntless bombers from USS Enterprise arrived during the Japanese attack, their pilots forced to fight their way through Zero fighters just to land at Ford Island. Several Dauntless bombers were shot down. Others were damaged landing on smoking airstrips. The baptism of fire was brutal. Wake Island fell in December 1941 despite desperate defense by Marine SBD pilots who flew until their aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Philippines fell in May 1942. The Dutch East Indies fell. Everywhere, Japanese forces advanced with shocking speed and coordination, their carrier-based air power overwhelming Allied defenses that seemed perpetually outmatched. But something changed during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. For the first time in history, 2 carrier fleets fought without ever seeing each other's ships. Aircraft carried the battle across hundreds of miles of ocean. And in that battle, SBD Dauntless bombers from USS Lexington and USS Yorktown proved they could hit Japanese carriers. On May 8, 1942, Dauntless pilots found the Japanese carrier Shoho and hit it with 13 bombs in 4 minutes. The carrier exploded and sank, taking 631 of its 834 crew members down with it. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon's famous radio call, "Scratch one flat top," announced to the fleet that carrier warfare had entered a new era. Later that day, Dauntless bombers damaged the carrier Shokaku so severely it would miss the upcoming Midway operation. The Japanese had won a tactical victory at Coral Sea, sinking USS Lexington, but they had lost strategically. Two of their fleet carriers were unavailable for Admiral Yamamoto's planned assault on Midway Island, the tiny atoll that would become the hinge of the Pacific War. Japanese confidence in June 1942 stood at its historical zenith. In 6 months of war, their forces had conquered an empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Their carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake, Rabaul, Darwin, and Ceylon, were the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Their carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, represented the finest naval aviation technology Japan could produce. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, believed that one more decisive victory would force America to negotiate peace. Midway Island, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, would be the target. Its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and potentially draw out the weakened American carrier fleet for destruction. Japanese planning for Midway reflected the overconfidence that had built through 6 months of unbroken victories. Yamamoto divided his forces into multiple groups spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The Kido-butai, the carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would attack Midway with 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 12 destroyers. Following behind, Yamamoto commanded the main body with 3 battleships including the massive Yamato, plus additional cruisers and destroyers. A separate invasion force carried 5,000 troops to occupy the island. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American codebreakers had pierced Japanese naval communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had identified AF as the target and predicted June 4th as the attack date. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, would be waiting with 3 carriers and every aircraft he could scrape together. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, both veterans of the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, sortied from Pearl Harbor on May 28th. USS Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea and given only 72 hours of emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor, limped out to join them on May 30th. Japanese intelligence believed Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. The American carriers carried 79 SBD Dauntless dive bombers among their total air groups. Enterprise had Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6. Hornet had Bombing Squadron 8 and Scouting Squadron 8. Yorktown, despite its hasty repairs and depleted air group, had Bombing Squadron 3. Additionally, 27 Marine SBD Dauntless bombers were stationed on Midway Island itself, ready to launch attacks when the Japanese appeared. These 106 Dauntless bombers represented America's primary offensive weapon at Midway. The torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, would prove death traps for their crews. The fighters, obsolete F-4F Wildcats, would be outperformed by Japanese Zeros. But the Dauntless bombers, if they could reach the Japanese carriers, if they could penetrate the defensive fighter screen, if they could survive the intense anti-aircraft fire, might change history. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey understood the stakes as he led Enterprise's air group toward the projected Japanese position on the morning of June 4th. The 37-year-old Annapolis graduate had never led a strike of this magnitude. His pilots, many of them in combat for the first time, trusted his judgment completely. That trust would be tested beyond anything they had imagined. The launch from Enterprise had been chaotic. Hornet's air group had departed first, but coordination between the 2 carriers had been minimal. Yorktown's bombers would launch later, after Nagumo's carriers had been located by reconnaissance aircraft. The plan was simple in concept: overwhelm the Japanese carriers with coordinated strikes from multiple directions. but the vast distances involved and the primitive navigation equipment of 1942 made coordination nearly impossible. McCluskey's force of 33 Dauntless bombers from Enterprise, plus 14 from Hornet that managed to join up, flew southwest toward the coordinates where Japanese carriers should have been. At 9:20 a.m., they reached the designated position. The ocean below was empty. No carriers, no ships, nothing but blue water stretching to the horizon in every direction. The Japanese carriers had turned north after launching their first strike on Midway. Nagumo had received reports of American ships in the area and was repositioning to attack them. This course change, unknown to McCluskey, had opened a 60-mile gap between where the Japanese were supposed to be and where they actually were. A gap that was rapidly consuming American fuel supplies. McCluskey made his decision. Instead of turning back, he would search. He led his bombers west, calculating that the Japanese must be somewhere ahead. His fuel gauge showed he had perhaps 30 minutes of search time before he would have to turn back or ditch in the ocean. Behind him, 32 other pilots watched their own fuel gauges and wondered if they would die searching for an enemy they might never find. At 9:55 a.m., Ensign William Pittman, flying in the rear of the formation, spotted a ship's wake far below. He didn't break radio silence, but he waggled his wings to signal McCluskey. The wake was arrow straight, heading northeast. McCluskey made an instant calculation. That wasn't a random course. That ship was rushing toward something, perhaps toward the Japanese carriers. McCluskey turned his entire formation to follow the wake. The ship was the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which had been depth-charging the American submarine USS Nautilus. Having completed its attack, Arashi was racing at flank speed to rejoin the carrier fleet. It was, unknowingly, leading McCluskey directly to his targets. While McCluskey searched, the Battle of Midway had already exacted its terrible price on American forces. Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had found the Japanese carriers at 9:20 a.m. Without fighter escort, flying at wavetop level at 100 miles per hour, they had pressed their attack against the full fury of Japanese air defense. 0 fighters swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening ships tore through their formations. One by one, the devastators fell. Waldron's aircraft exploded. Lieutenant Raymond Moore's bomber cartwheeled into the ocean. Ensign George Gay's plane, the last one still flying, dropped its torpedo and was immediately shot down. Gay, the only survivor of Torpedo 8, clung to a seat cushion in the water and watched the rest of the battle unfold. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 attacked at 9:40 a.m. They had become separated from McCluskey's bombers and had found the Japanese carriers on their own. Again, 0 fighters and anti-aircraft fire created a killing field. 14 aircraft attacked. 10 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 followed at 10 a.m. 12 aircraft attacked. 10 were shot down. Again, no hits. In less than an hour, American torpedo squadrons had been annihilated. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers, only 6 survived. Not one torpedo hit its target. The sacrifice seemed futile, wasteful, the inevitable result of obsolete equipment facing a superior enemy. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something the dying crews never knew. They had pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to wavetop level. Every 0 fighter was low, chasing torpedo bombers. The anti-aircraft gunners on the screening ships were focused on the low-altitude threat, and most critically, the Japanese carriers were in the midst of a catastrophic decision that would seal their fate. Admiral Nagumo had launched his first strike on Midway at 4:30 a.m. with 108 aircraft. That strike had hit the island hard, but hadn't achieved the destruction Nagumo wanted. At 7 a.m., he had ordered his reserve strike force, which had been armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships, to be rearmed with land bombs for a second strike on Midway. This process, swapping out one type of ordnance for another, required bringing aircraft up from the hangar decks, physically removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, and replacing them with high-explosive land bombs. Then at 7:28 a.m., a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported sighting American ships. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming process reversed. Land bombs off, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs back on. The ordnance crews began the laborious process again. The hangar decks of the Japanese carriers became chaotic scenes of organized confusion, with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines scattered across the decks as crews frantically worked to prepare aircraft for launch. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo's first strike force began returning from Midway. Many aircraft were damaged. Some were nearly out of fuel. All needed to land immediately. But Nagumo couldn't launch his rearmed strike force until he had recovered the Midway strike. Standard Japanese doctrine required clearing the carrier's decks for landing operations. The American torpedo attacks, beginning at 9:20 a.m., had forced Nagumo to turn his carriers into the wind and maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes. This interrupted the landing and refueling operations. By 10:20 a.m., all 4 Japanese carriers had their decks crowded with aircraft. Some were being refueled, others were being rearmed. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden decks. Bombs and torpedoes sat in racks, waiting to be loaded. The carriers were floating arsenals, ready to launch a devastating counterstrike against the American carriers. All they needed was 15 more minutes to get their aircraft launched. At 10:22 a.m., Wade McCluskey looked down from 20,000 feet and saw the most beautiful sight any American pilot had witnessed since the war began. 4 Japanese carriers in a neat rectangular formation, steaming northward, their decks crowded with aircraft. There were no fighters at altitude. The Zeros were all down low, still chasing the last remnants of the American torpedo squadrons. The carriers were completely exposed. McCluskey didn't hesitate. He selected the 2 carriers on the left side of the formation, Kaga and Akagi, for his Enterprise squadrons. He radioed Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, leading Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3, which had just arrived from a different direction. Leslie's 17 Dauntless bombers would hit Soryu, the carrier on the right. Through pure coincidence, 2 American dive bomber formations had arrived over the Japanese fleet from different directions at exactly the same moment. The timing wasn't coordination, it was miracle. McCluskey pushed his Dauntless into a split S maneuver, rolling inverted and pulling through into a steep dive. Behind him, 32 other Dauntless bombers followed, splitting into 2 groups. Lieutenant Richard Best would lead Bombing Squadron 6 against Akagi, the flagship. McCluskey would lead Scouting Squadron 6 against Kaga. At the same moment, Leslie's Yorktown bombers began their dives on Soryu. The dive bombing doctrine was simple, but required extraordinary precision. Begin the dive at 20,000 feet. Roll to 70 degrees, nearly vertical. Extend the dive brakes, perforated panels that deployed from the wings to slow the aircraft and stabilize it during the plunge. Acquire the target through the bomb sight mounted on the left side of the cockpit. Make minor corrections with rudder and elevator. At 2,500 feet, release the bomb, pull the stick back hard into a 7G turn, and climb away from the anti-aircraft fire. In training, pilots spent hundreds of hours perfecting this sequence. In combat, they would have one chance to get it right. Lieutenant Richard Best selected Akagi as his target. The flagship was turning hard to starboard, trying to evade, but Best corrected for the turn. His Bombardier Aviation Radioman Second Class Thomas Murray sat backward in the rear cockpit, watching the sky above for enemy fighters, while Best concentrated on the dive. At 2,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled up so hard that he grayed out momentarily from the G-forces. The bomb fell away, accelerating to over 300 miles per hour. 1,000 feet above Akagi's flight deck, it was still invisible to the crew below. At 500 feet, someone spotted it. At 100 feet, sailors dove for cover. The bomb struck the flight deck slightly aft of amidships, penetrated to the hangar deck, and detonated among the aircraft being rearmed with torpedoes and bombs. The explosion was catastrophic. Secondary explosions rippled through the hangar deck as torpedoes detonated. Aviation fuel ignited, creating a fireball that shot up through the elevator well and engulfed the flight deck. Within 30 seconds, Akagi was transformed from the pride of the Japanese Navy into a floating inferno. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, diving on Kaga, saw his 1,000-pound bomb strike the carrier near the forward elevator. Again, the bomb penetrated to the hangar deck before exploding. Kaga, which had 18 aircraft on its flight deck being refueled and rearmed, erupted in flames. Explosions walked up the length of the ship as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the inferno. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive on Soryu was textbook perfect. His bomb struck squarely on the forward flight deck. 3 more Dauntless bombers from Yorktown followed, their bombs hitting in rapid succession. Soryu, the smallest and oldest of the 4 carriers, suffered catastrophic damage. Fires spread rapidly through the ship. The torpedo and bomb magazines detonated, breaking the carrier's back. The entire attack, from the first bomb release to the last, took 5 minutes. 3 Japanese carriers, representing decades of industrial investment and naval expertise, were mortally wounded in less time than it took to soft-boil an egg. The Japanese destroyer Arashi, whose wake had led McCluskey to the target, watched the attack from its position on the screening perimeter. Its captain, Commander Yasumasa Watanabe, would write in his after-action report that the American dive bombers appeared with the ruthlessness of demons. 0 fighters, still at low altitude chasing torpedo bombers, climbed frantically toward the diving Dauntless bombers, but arrived too late to prevent the initial strikes. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood frozen as his flagship burned. The bombs had destroyed the carrier's steering mechanism. Fires raged out of control below decks. The ship was circling helplessly, unable to launch aircraft or fight fires effectively. At 10:46 a.m., just 24 minutes after the first bomb hit, Nagumo transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, abandoning his flagship to its fate. Kaga's fires reached the forward magazine at 10:40 a.m. The resulting explosion blew out the carrier's bottom. The ship began settling by the bow, water pouring through the massive hole in its hull. Captain Jisaku Okada ordered abandon ship at 4:30 p.m. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m., taking 811 of its crew down with it. Soryu's situation was equally desperate. The bombs had ruptured the carrier's aviation fuel tanks, spreading fire throughout the ship. Explosions racked the vessel as ammunition cooked off. At 10:45 a.m., Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto ordered his crew to abandon ship, though he reportedly went down with his vessel. Soryu sank at 7:13 p.m. on June 4th. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, had been separated from the other 3 by Nagumo's maneuvering during the torpedo attacks. It missed the first wave of American dive bombers entirely. At 10:40 a.m., as Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Hiryu's deck was clear and its aircraft were ready. Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, immediately launched a counter-strike. 18 Aichi-D 3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters lifted off from Hiryu at 10:40 a.m., following the retiring American aircraft back toward their carriers. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike force, determined to avenge the devastating attack on his sister carriers. The Japanese strike found Yorktown at 12:10 p.m. The American carrier had been recovering its aircraft and was vulnerable. 8 Val dive bombers penetrated the fighter screen and anti-aircraft fire. 3 bombs hit Yorktown in quick succession. The first bomb struck the flight deck near the island superstructure, penetrating 4 decks before exploding and killing dozens of sailors. The second bomb struck amidships, snuffing out the fires in 5 of the ship's 6 boilers. The third bomb hit the smokestack, shattering the uptakes and starting fires throughout the ship. Yorktown went dead in the water, listing fires raging in its vitals. But American damage control teams performed miracles. Within an hour, they had restored power to 1 boiler, patched the worst holes, and brought the list under control. By 1:40 p.m., Yorktown was making 19 knots and recovering aircraft. At 2:30 p.m., Hiryu launched a second strike, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. They found Yorktown at 3:30 p.m. and pressed home their attack with the same desperate courage that had characterized the American torpedo attacks that morning. 4 torpedoes struck Yorktown's portside, tearing massive holes in the hull. The carrier immediately took on a dangerous list. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship at 5 p.m., but Hiryu's second strike had revealed its position to American reconnaissance aircraft. At 3:30 p.m., as Hiryu's aircraft were attacking Yorktown, 24 Dauntless bombers from Enterprise launched for a revenge strike. Among them were pilots who had survived the morning attack and immediately volunteered for a second mission, despite exhaustion and low fuel states. They found Hiryu at 5 p.m., steaming alone without its sister carriers. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who had hit Kaga in the morning, led the attack. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, turning it into the 4th funeral pyre of the day. The bombs penetrated to the hangar deck, where they detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft. The explosions and fires were immediately catastrophic. Admiral Yamaguchi, who had stayed with his flagship, ordered abandoned ship at 3:15 a.m. on June 5th. Hiryu sank at 9 a.m., taking Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku down with it. The 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had been the tip of the Japanese spear in 6 months of victories, were gone. Destroyed in 1 day by an aircraft that Japanese pilots had considered obsolete. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day represented a catastrophe from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. Beyond the ships themselves, gone were 332 aircraft, 2,155 crew members killed, and most critically, hundreds of veteran pilots and maintenance crews who represented years of training and combat experience that Japan simply could not replace. In Tokyo, the news was suppressed. The Japanese public was told of a great victory at Midway, with the loss of only 1 carrier. The emperor himself was not immediately informed of the full extent of the disaster. But in the naval staff offices, senior officers understood that June 4th, 1942, had transformed the strategic situation in the Pacific. Japan's offensive capability had been shattered. The initiative had passed to America. Admiral Yamamoto initially continued with his plan to invade Midway, ordering his battleships and cruisers to bombard the island. But without air cover, surface ships couldn't approach an island defended by American aircraft. On June 5th, he cancelled the operation and ordered the fleet to withdraw. The retreat was chaotic. American submarines and aircraft harassed the retiring Japanese forces. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma collided during evasive maneuvers. On June 6th, Dauntless bombers from Enterprise and Hornet caught Mikuma and sank it with multiple bomb hits. Mogami, heavily damaged, barely made it back to Truk. The American victory came at a cost. Yorktown, abandoned after the Japanese torpedo attack, was taken under tow on June 5th, with salvage crews working to save her. But on June 6th, the Japanese submarine E-168 penetrated the destroyer screen and torpedoed both Yorktown and the destroyer USS Hamon. Hamon sank within 4 minutes. Yorktown, which had survived bomb and torpedo damage, finally rolled over and sank at 7:01 a.m. on June 7th. The SBD Dauntless crews paid their price as well. Of the 41 torpedo bomber crew members who attacked the Japanese carriers, 35 were killed. The torpedo bombers absorbed the defensive attention that allowed the Dauntless bombers to reach their targets. But of the 79 Dauntless bombers that participated in the battle, 40 were lost or damaged. Some ran out of fuel searching for the carriers and ditched at sea. Others were shot down by Zeros or anti-aircraft fire. Several crashed attempting to land on damaged carrier decks. The crews who changed history at Midway paid for that achievement with extraordinary casualties. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey himself barely survived. After the morning strike on Kaga, his Dauntless was hit by anti-aircraft fire, wounding him in the shoulder and leg. He flew back to Enterprise, losing blood throughout the flight, and managed to land despite his wounds. He was immediately taken to sickbay, where doctors worked to stabilize him. For his leadership and his decision to search beyond the expected position, McCluskey received the Navy Cross, America's second highest decoration for valor. Lieutenant Richard Best, who had bombed Akagi with devastating accuracy, also paid a physical price. During the dive, his oxygen system had malfunctioned, exposing him to caustic soda used to scrub CO2 from the breathing system. The chemical burned his lungs. After one more combat mission on June 6th against the cruiser Mikuma, Best was medically evacuated from the combat zone. He spent months recovering and never flew combat again, though he lived until 2001, long enough to see his actions at Midway recognized as decisive to American victory. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was picked up by a PBY Catalina flying boat on June 5th. His testimony provided American intelligence with detailed information about the Japanese carriers and their defensive tactics. Gay became a celebrity, the man who watched the Battle of Midway from a seat cushion in the ocean. He survived the war and became an advocate for remembering the sacrifice of his squadron mates who didn't return. The strategic implications of Midway rippled across the Pacific and beyond. Japan's plan to extend its defensive perimeter died with the 4 carriers. Without carrier air power to support amphibious operations, Japanese expansion stopped. The resource-rich territories Japan had conquered in the first 6 months of war would have to be defended with what they had. No more conquests, no more easy victories. For the United States, Midway provided proof that American training, tactics, and determination could overcome early disadvantages. The victory occurred just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, when American industrial production was only beginning to accelerate. If America could win at Midway with 3 carriers against 4, what would happen when American shipyards delivered dozens of new carriers backed by thousands of new aircraft? The Japanese naval staff understood the implications immediately. In a June 1942 analysis, they concluded that Japan had lost the strategic initiative and must now fight defensively. Combined Fleet Staff Officer Commander Yasuji Watanabe wrote, "After Midway, the American advance was predictable and irresistible. We could only delay, not prevent, their victory." The SBD Dauntless would continue to be the primary American dive bomber through 1943, participating in every major Pacific campaign. At Guadalcanal, Dauntless bombers from Henderson Field and from carriers offshore attacked Japanese ships attempting to reinforce the island. The Tokyo Express destroyer runs were hunted by Marine Dauntless pilots who learned to bomb at night, a skill that Japanese planners had believed impossible for American pilots. During the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, Dauntless bombers from Enterprise sank the battleship Hiei, demonstrating that dive bombers could destroy even the most heavily armored ships with precision bombing. The aircraft that skeptics had dismissed was rewriting the rules of naval warfare with each mission. But beyond the tactical victories, the Dauntless had accomplished something more profound. It had proven that wars were won not by technological superiority alone, but by the combination of adequate technology, superior training, tactical flexibility, and the courage to press attacks despite casualties. The Japanese had superior fighters in the Zero. They had equal or better torpedo bombers, but they had no answer to the Dauntless dive bomber when it was employed with the skill, American pilots demonstrated at Midway. The Japanese Navy attempted to learn from Midway. They analyzed American tactics, studied captured American aircraft, and tried to develop countermeasures. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and should have led the Midway strike, but was hospitalized with appendicitis, wrote extensive reports on American dive bombing tactics. His recommendations included dispersing carriers more widely, maintaining fighter cover at all altitudes, and never allowing aircraft to be serviced on deck with fuel lines and ordnance exposed. But knowledge of what to do differed from having the resources to do it. Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. Where American shipyards would produce dozens of Essex-class carriers between 1943 and 1945, Japan would struggle to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, wouldn't be commissioned until November 1944 and would be sunk by an American submarine 10 days later without ever engaging in combat. Pilot training was another insurmountable gap. Before Midway, Japanese carrier pilots had averaged 800 flight hours before entering combat. American pilots averaged 300 hours. But after Midway, as Japan's veteran pilots were killed in combat and fuel shortages limited training, new Japanese pilots entered combat with as little as 100 hours of flight time. American training programs, meanwhile, expanded to provide 400 hours or more of flight time, creating a pilot quality gap that widened throughout the war. The technology gap also reversed. The SBD Dauntless, obsolete in 1942, was gradually replaced by the superior SB-2C Helldiver, beginning in 1943. But even as the Dauntless was phased out of carrier service, Marine squadrons continued flying it until 1944, testament to the aircraft's reliability and effectiveness. The total production run of 5,936 SBD Dauntless bombers represented a modest investment compared to other American aircraft, but their impact on the war's outcome was disproportionate to their numbers. German naval observers studying the Battle of Midway reached sobering conclusions. A June 1942 Kriegsmarine analysis noted that American dive bomber tactics were superior to Luftwaffe methods and that the combination of radar-directed fighter direction and precision dive bombing created a defensive capability that German aircraft would struggle to penetrate. These observations influenced German naval aviation development, though by 1942, Germany had effectively abandoned aircraft carrier construction. The most detailed German analysis came from Fregattenkapitän Kurt Fricker, who wrote in July 1942, "The American victory at Midway demonstrates that carrier aviation has become the decisive factor in naval warfare. The Americans showed superior tactical flexibility, recovering from severe losses to their torpedo squadrons and exploiting Japanese vulnerabilities with precision. Most significant was their willingness to accept heavy casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. This determination, combined with their industrial capacity, makes them formidable opponents." Soviet naval observers, though not directly involved in the Pacific War, also studied Midway extensively. Their analysis focused on the importance of intelligence, noting that American code-breaking had provided the crucial advantage of knowing when and where the Japanese would attack. Soviet naval doctrine began emphasizing the importance of secure communications and the vulnerability of forces whose movements were predictable. For the SBD Dauntless crews who survived Midway, the battle became the defining moment of their lives. They had participated in the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar, sinking 4 enemy carriers in one day. The statistics they compiled would never be matched in naval aviation history. No other aircraft type would sink 4 fleet carriers in a single battle. No other 5-minute period would have such strategic impact on a global conflict. The aircrew who flew Dauntless bombers at Midway developed an enduring bond. They formed veteran associations, attended reunions, and ensured that the story of June 4, 1942 was preserved for future generations. Many wrote memoirs or cooperated with historians documenting the battle. They knew they had witnessed history and wanted that history recorded accurately. But they also mourned the cost. The Torpedo 8 Memorial at Naval Air Station Pensacola lists the names of 29 crew members who died attacking the Japanese carriers. Similar memorials honor the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. The Dauntless pilots who survived did so partly because their squadron mates in the torpedo bombers had pulled Japanese defenses down to wave-top level. This knowledge created a sense of obligation among the survivors to honor those who didn't return. The technical lessons from Midway influenced American aircraft development for the remainder of the war. The importance of dive brakes for controlling descent speed was emphasized in all subsequent dive bomber designs. The need for redundant systems, armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks became standard requirements. The value of a rear-facing gunner who could defend against fighter attacks and serve as an extra set of eyes during the dive was validated repeatedly. But the most important lesson was operational. Midway proved that precision attacks on high-value targets could achieve strategic results that massed attacks on multiple targets could not. The dauntless crews who concentrated their bombs on the carrier's vulnerable hangar decks, where fuel and ordnance created catastrophic secondary explosions, had achieved more with 40 bombers than entire air forces achieved, with hundreds of aircraft striking dispersed targets. This lesson influenced American operational planning throughout the war. Instead of attacking multiple Japanese bases simultaneously, American forces concentrated overwhelming force on key positions. The island hopping campaign that followed Midway focused on seizing islands that controlled sea lanes while bypassing heavily defended positions. This economy of force, using precision rather than mass, reflected the lessons the Dauntless pilots had demonstrated. The Japanese never fully absorbed the Midway lessons. Throughout 1943 and 1944, they continued concentrating vulnerable ships in tight formations that presented perfect targets for American dive bombers. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American carrier aircraft destroyed 3 Japanese carriers using tactics refined from Midway. The Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated that the Japanese had not solved the problem of defending carriers against determined dive bomber attacks. By 1944, the SBD Dauntless was being phased out of carrier service, replaced by the more capable SB-2C Helldiver. But pilots who transitioned to the new aircraft often expressed nostalgia for the reliable, forgiving Dauntless. The Helldiver was faster and carried a heavier bomb load, but it was also more complex and less reliable. Many pilots believed the Dauntless was the better combat aircraft, despite its obsolescence on paper. The final combat missions flown by carrier-based Dauntless bombers occurred in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Marine squadrons continued operating SBDs from land bases until September 1944. The last combat loss of a Dauntless occurred on September 5, 1944, when a Marine aircraft was shot down over Peleliu. By war's end, the SBD Dauntless had flown its last combat mission, but its place in naval aviation history was secure. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese historians consistently ranked the SBD Dauntless as one of the most important aircraft of World War II. Samuel Eliot Morrison, in his official history of U.S. naval operations in World War II, wrote, "The SBD Dauntless was the most important aircraft in the Pacific War. Its victory at Midway changed the course of the war more decisively than any other single event." Japanese historians were equally frank in acknowledging the Dauntless's impact. Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya, in their book Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, wrote, "The SBD's precision and the skill of its pilots were decisive. We had no equivalent aircraft and no tactics to counter it effectively. The Dauntless, more than any other weapon, destroyed the Kidobutai." The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war examined the effectiveness of different American aircraft types. The SBD Dauntless received high marks for accuracy, survivability, and ease of maintenance. The survey noted that Dauntless bombers achieved hit rates of 50 to 60% in dive bombing attacks, compared to 10 to 20% for horizontal bombers. This precision made the Dauntless far more effective per sortie than aircraft carrying heavier bomb loads but lacking accuracy. Modern historians, with access to Japanese archives and more complete American records, have refined understanding of Midway but not changed its fundamental narrative. The SBD Dauntless, flown by well-trained pilots who were willing to press their attacks despite losses, sank 4 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes because they arrived at the decisive moment when those carriers were most vulnerable. The timing was partly luck. If McCluskey had turned back when he failed to find the carriers at their expected position, if he hadn't followed the destroyer Arashi's wake, if the torpedo bombers hadn't pulled Japanese fighters down to low altitude, the attack might have failed. But luck favors the prepared. McCluskey made the right decision to continue searching. The Dauntless pilots executed their dives with textbook precision. The torpedo bomber crews sacrificed themselves to create the opportunity. Skill, training, courage, and yes, luck combined to produce the most decisive 5 minutes in naval history. The survivors carried those 5 minutes with them for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who hit both Kaga and Hiryu, said in a 1990 interview, "We knew we'd done something important, but we didn't realize how important until years later. We were just trying to hit the target and get home. The fact that we changed the war, that we stopped the Japanese advance, that didn't sink in until after the battle was over." Wade McCluskey, recovering from his wounds, returned to combat in 1943 and flew missions over Europe. He retired as a Rear Admiral in 1956 and spent his later years speaking about Midway. In a 1976 speech, he said, "People call me a hero. I'm not. I was an officer doing my duty. The real heroes are the torpedo bomber pilots who died drawing Japanese fighters away from us. The real heroes are the young pilots who followed me into those dives without knowing if they'd survive. I just made one good decision. They made their decisions knowing they might not come back." The technical specifications of the SBD Dauntless, unremarkable when compared to other contemporary aircraft, tell part of the story. Maximum speed, 255 miles per hour. Range, 1,115 miles. Service ceiling, 25,530 feet. Bomb load, one 1,000-pound bomb or one 500-pound bomb plus 2 100-pound bombs. Crew, 2. These numbers don't capture why the aircraft was effective. The Dauntless succeeded not because of superior specifications, but because of superior design philosophy. Ed Heinemann, the chief designer, had prioritized survivability over performance. The dive brakes that slowed the aircraft during dives also stabilized it, allowing more accurate bombing. The redundant hydraulic systems meant one battle damage hit rarely disabled the aircraft completely. The armor protection for the crew, though it added weight, saved lives. The self-sealing fuel tanks, which cost money and reduced fuel capacity, prevented aircraft from burning when hit. These design choices, pragmatic rather than ambitious, created an aircraft that brought its crews home. The maintenance crews who kept the Dauntless bombers flying rarely received the recognition they deserve. On carrier decks, in tropical heat or Pacific storms, mechanics performed miracles keeping aircraft operational. The Dauntless's reliability was partly due to good design and partly due to the skill of the men who maintained it. At Midway, Enterprise and Yorktown's aviation mechanics had 79 Dauntless bombers operational on the morning of June 4th. Given the hasty repairs to Yorktown, the rough carrier landings that damaged aircraft, and the limited spare parts available, maintaining that operational rate represented an achievement equal to the pilot's combat performance. The radio operator gunners who sat in the rear cockpit, operating the defensive .30 caliber machine gun, while the pilot dove toward the target, were equally crucial. They watched for enemy fighters, called out threats, and defended the aircraft during the vulnerable climb away from the target. At Midway, radio operator gunners shot down several Japanese fighters and drove off many more. Their presence transformed the Dauntless from a sitting duck into an aircraft that could defend itself, at least partially, from fighter attack. One radio operator gunner, aviation radioman third class Bruno Gaido, became a legend. During the Marshall Islands raid in February 1942, Gaido's Dauntless was hit by Japanese aircraft while parked on Enterprise's deck. The pilot had already left the aircraft, but Gaido jumped into the rear cockpit, manned the machine gun, and shot down the attacking Japanese aircraft. At Midway, flying with Ensign Franco Flaherty, Gaido helped damage the carrier Kaga. When their aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched, both men were captured by Japanese forces. They were interrogated, weighted with chains, and thrown overboard to drown. Their sacrifice exemplified the courage of radio operator gunners, who fought knowing they were vulnerable throughout every mission. The Douglas Aircraft Company, which built the Dauntless, never achieved the fame of Boeing with its B-17 or North American with its P-51. But Douglas's contributions to American victory were enormous. Beyond the Dauntless, Douglas built the C-47 transport that supplied armies worldwide, the A-20 attack bomber that supported ground forces, and the B-26 medium bomber that struck tactical targets. Douglas represented American industrial pragmatism. Build what works, build it well, build it in quantity. The total production cost of 5,936 SBD Dauntless bombers was approximately $1.2 billion in the 1940s. Each aircraft cost roughly $200,000 to manufacture, equip, and deliver. This investment, modest compared to the billions spent on battleships or heavy bombers, produced disproportionate returns. The 4 Japanese carriers sunk at Midway represented over $250 million in 1940s construction costs, plus the inestimable value of experienced pilots and crew. By any economic calculation, the Dauntless was an excellent investment. But the true value of the SBD Dauntless cannot be measured in economic terms. Its value lay in what it accomplished at the strategic level. By sinking 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, the Dauntless eliminated Japan's offensive capability and shifted the Pacific War's initiative to America. By proving that precision attacks on vulnerable targets could achieve decisive results, it validated an operational approach that America would employ throughout the war. By demonstrating that adequate technology combined with superior training could defeat nominally superior forces, it provided evidence that American methods could win. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to the Dauntless-style dive bomber. They tried dispersing carriers more widely, which reduced coordination. They tried increasing fighter cover, which required more carriers to protect the same number of strike aircraft. They tried improved anti-aircraft weapons, which were effective but never decisive. They tried better damage control, which could contain fires but not prevent the initial damage. None of these measures solved the fundamental problem. A well-flown dive bomber, attacking from high altitude at high speed, was nearly impossible to stop if it reached attack position. American tactical doctrine evolved from Midway. The concept of coordinated attacks by torpedo bombers, drawing defenses low, while dive bombers attacked from altitude, became standard. Fighter escorts were integrated more effectively with bombing strikes. Radar-directed fighter coverage improved, making it harder for enemy aircraft to achieve surprise. Radio communications between aircraft improved, allowing better coordination during attacks. All these improvements built on lessons learned at Midway. The German military studied Midway extensively, though they drew conclusions that emphasized their existing biases. The Luftwaffe noted the effectiveness of dive bombing, but ignored the importance of carriers, since Germany had effectively abandoned carrier construction. The Kriegsmarine understood that American carrier power made naval operations in the Atlantic increasingly dangerous, but lacked the resources to counter it. By 1943, German surface raiders had ceased operations partly because American carrier task forces made the Atlantic inhospitable to surface ships without air cover. Soviet analysis of Midway was more sophisticated. Soviet naval theorists understood that carrier aviation had become the dominant form of naval power and that future Soviet naval development must emphasize naval aviation. This analysis influenced post-war Soviet naval construction, though economic limitations prevented the Soviet Navy from building large carrier fleets until the 1980s. The enduring image of Midway is the SBD Dauntless in its dive, plummeting nearly vertically toward a Japanese carrier with its dive brakes deployed. The pilot hunched over his bomb sight, making final corrections while anti-aircraft fire bursts around him. This image, captured in combat photographs and recreated in countless illustrations, represents not just one aircraft or one battle, but the moment when American determination and skill overcame initial disadvantages to seize the initiative in the Pacific War. The men who flew those dives knew they were risking their lives. They understood that Japanese fighters might intercept them, that anti-aircraft fire might destroy them, that mechanical failure might doom them. They dove anyway, because they were professionals executing their mission. The courage required to push a dive bomber into a near-vertical plunge toward a heavily defended target, knowing that pulling out too early meant missing the target and pulling out too late meant crashing into it, was extraordinary. That 40 pilots did this within minutes of each other, while under fire, while low on fuel, while knowing their shipmates were dying around them, represented collective courage that few military operations have ever matched. Wade McCluskey's decision to continue searching when he failed to find the carriers at their expected position was the hinge on which Midway turned. Had he turned back, his bombers would have missed the battle. The Japanese carriers, after recovering and refueling their aircraft, would have launched a devastating strike on the American carriers. The Battle of Midway would likely have ended in American defeat, potentially losing all 3 American carriers. The Pacific War would have continued for years longer, costing hundreds of thousands more lives. One man's decision, made in the cockpit of an obsolete dive bomber while circling over empty ocean, changed history. This is what made Midway decisive, and what makes the SBD Dauntless memorable. Not its specifications, not its technology, but what it accomplished in the hands of skilled, determined pilots who refused to give up when the situation looked hopeless. The final word on the SBD Dauntless should come from those who faced it. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japanese carrier forces at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, was asked after the war what he most feared about American naval aviation. His answer: the Dauntless pilots. They were accurate, determined, and seemingly impossible to stop. When our lookouts reported dive bombers overhead, we knew bombs would hit our carriers. The Americans never missed. That accuracy, that determination, that refusal to accept defeat, characterized not just the SBD Dauntless, but the men who flew it. At Midway, they turned the tide of the Pacific War in 5 minutes. They sank 4 Japanese carriers while flying an aircraft many considered obsolete. They proved that courage and skill could overcome technical disadvantage. They demonstrated that in war, human factors matter more than hardware specifications. The SBD Dauntless flew its last combat mission in 1944, but its legacy endures. Every American carrier aircraft since has incorporated lessons learned from the Dauntless: the importance of accuracy over payload, the value of survivability, the need for crew protection. Modern carrier-based strike aircraft, with their precision-guided weapons and advanced avionics, are the technological descendants of the humble SBD. The doctrine of precision strikes against high-value targets, now executed with missiles launched from hundreds of miles away, traces its lineage to the dauntless pilots who dove through anti-aircraft fire to place bombs on carrier decks. The Battle of Midway stands as the most decisive naval engagement in American history and one of the most decisive battles of World War II. The SBD Dauntless, flown by pilots who refused to accept defeat, sank 4 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes and changed the course of the war. That achievement, remarkable in 1942, remains unmatched in the history of naval aviation. No other aircraft type has sunk 4 fleet carriers in a single battle. No other 5-minute period has had such strategic impact. The men who flew the Dauntless at Midway, those who survived and those who didn't return, deserve remembrance not as victims of an obsolete aircraft, but as victors who used every advantage their training and courage could provide to defeat a superior enemy force. They dove through fire. They pressed their attacks despite losses. They hit their targets with precision that stunned even their enemies. And they changed history. On June 4th, 1942, at 10:22 a.m., Wade McCluskey looked down from 20,000 feet and saw 4 Japanese carriers. By 10:27 a.m., 3 of them were burning wrecks. That transformation from Japanese offensive power to Japanese defeat was accomplished by 40 SBD Dauntless dive bombers flown by pilots who understood that precision, courage, and determination could overcome any disadvantage. They were right. The SBD Dauntless won Midway, and Midway won the Pacific War.